this common way of thinking, you know. But in my community, I come from Clear Lake, you know, and we were affected by the mission system. A lot of people don't talk about the gold rush and the effect that had on the Native California people. You know, there was 120,000 people killed in a 20-year span from 1848, you know, 20 years after that, you know, from when it started. And we're talking about to teach the language, because he would do language classes. He goes, because in order for you to understand the language, it's like you think in the language that you speak first. And because where I come from, the language was pretty much gone. You know, we grew up with English, so we think in English. And so when we try to learn the language, there's this gap. You know, we have a hard time understanding because we think in English first. You know, we think about convenience. We think about, oh, this is too hard. We don't want to sacrifice. You know, and we think that way first. And so it's about changing the way we think about things and the way we see things. You know, starting with ourselves, how we see ourselves. You know, because we were taught to be, you know, a certain way. You know, and to follow orders. You know, through the educational system. A friend of mine said, you know, the problem with formal education is that there's a certain amount of miseducation that has to happen. So there's a certain level of uneducating that has to happen in order for you to succeed in the formal education system. And a lot of that has to do with what we're taught as indigenous people, our ways, our cultures, and our songs and our dances, and things like that. And how we see each other, how we treat each other, how we treat ourselves. And so it's an honor, you know, to be here with you today. You know, and you know, like he was saying, you know, we're all different. I think of him, my friend Chris. You know, he's more vocal and upfront about things. You know, I'm more, as he was saying, you know, I'm looking for, well, how can we heal this situation? You know, I guess the healing. You know, who I am as a person, that's just who I am. You know, I don't try to go in his lane, you know, or his avenue and be somebody else who I'm not. You know, because I was brought up a certain way. You know, we had our roles as families that we had to do. You know, and so I encourage you, and I you know, encourage you to understand and remember who you are as a people, and find that out from your elders. You can try to think farther. Well, what would they think about the situation? And a lot of times, all you have to do is just question yourself. One of my aunts told me that. You know, question yourself. The answer will come to you. You know, if it's wrong, you'll know it's wrong. And if it's right, you'll know it's right too. But a lot of times, that's all you have to do. You know, but a lot of times, what we'll do is we'll go ask somebody else, you know, who we respect, and, you know, things like that. But just question yourself, because like you guys said earlier, you know, respectful, honest, the answers are there. You have them already. You already know what you're supposed to be doing, where you're supposed to be at. There's a reason why you're here today, because you understand that. And so I thank you for your time, you know, and that's all I'm going to share for now, and I'm going to pass it over to my brother Jose here. Oh.
I'll take, good afternoon, everybody. So, I know we're supposed to be talking about sovereignty and whatnot, but like we have to first define it. Like, what is it, right? So, there are many aspects of sovereignty that don't get talked about because they're uncomfortable. You know, the state of our people that we're living in is to understand that before you even approach any of these other obstacles. You know what I mean? It's like if your mom's having a crisis, you know, you gotta understand. It's like, is it a health crisis? Is it a mental crisis? Is it a safety crisis? You don't just say it's like, well, things will work themselves out. So it's the same thing with our sovereignty. It's like we have to understand the state that we're living in, right? So the first thing that we do, right, is that when somebody's pregnant, where do we take them? Where do people usually take, you know, when somebody's about to have a baby, where do you take them? To a hospital, right? Who runs a hospital? Do we run a hospital? No, right? So from birth, these kids are being born into the system. So you can like talk all this cultural stuff, talk all this like rhetoric, and learn all these things in college, but you don't practice them. You know, so once that kid is old enough to go to school, who teaches them? You know, where do they go to school? You know what I mean? So they go to that same system that we
that tie us together, right? So what are some of the things that tie us together besides bloodline? As a people, like, you know, whether it's like indigenous people, black people, Polynesian people, Asian people, what makes them a people? You know what I mean? Culture. Culture. Right? So if we can break down culture into different components, right? We have, I don't know, what makes culture? What is culture in you guys' eyes? Language? What else, you guys? Spirituality, right?
Housing.
Morals.
Huh?
Morals.
What about security? Security, you know what I'm saying? Like, the way we deal with conflict, the way we deal with strangers, the way we deal with other nations, like that's part of culture, right? That's gonna cap it off with education, right? Alright, so out of all these things, which ones do we control? How can we call ourselves sovereign, or even as a people, when all of these things are controlled by your oppressor, your former slave master, you know, your colonizer, you know, like, this is just one layer. You know, if we were to write the same list all over with a blue marker, it's not going to change. So after we were colonized by the Spanish, or the English, or the Portuguese, or the French, we had all these independence wars, but there was no shift in power. It was never like a rebellion from indigenous peoples of this continent, where it was like overthrown of the European governments. So now we're dealing with neo-colonialism. So when you look at the Mexican flag, when you look at the American flag, when you look at any other flag from this continent, you're looking at a neo-colonial flag that was put in power by the sons and daughters of the people who colonized in the first place. So that's another layer that's bearing you. So you have to be able to dig through all these layers in order for you to assert your true sovereignty. You cannot like halfway participate in sovereignty and halfway not. You know, once you understand that you are in a conflict of war that never ceases, it's a war of extermination. We're the only people in the world who have been targeted for extermination. Other peoples have been targeted for slavery, for like natural resources and exploitation, but not for extermination. So you have to understand that like our existence is like the most like revolutionary act of defiance that we can have. So, but it's still not a full-fledged existence, you know? So if Russia were to go into the Ukraine, able to control all these things in a way that is functioning. And once you're able to secure all these things, you still need an infrastructure to defend it. So if we look at the brothers in Chiapas and the Zapatistas, they understood all these things, but they understand that once they achieve them, that the government that they're working under can very easily just send soldiers at night. And that's, you know, never happened, right? That's what happened in El Salvador, happened in Guatemala, and we have all these, you know, quote-unquote civil wars that were instigated by the CIA. So we understand that no matter how peaceful we are, that we're in an abusive, like, violent, destructive regime that's not just the United States. It's not about like, oh, just blaming. It's a world. It's imperialism. That's what it's called. It's white supremacy disguised as imperialism, and that's what we're dealing with. And we have to confront those things. It's not about like, hey, let's just go and like, you know, burn white people. But it's about affronting the reality that we're living under an imperialist society. So before you try to even think about sovereignty, you have to be able to rid yourself of all these shackles. Can I control the education of my children? Can I control the food supply to my children? Can I make sure that my children are safe? Can I make sure that the women, the elders are safe and they don't have to fear about police raping them, about other people raping them, even our own people. We have to protect ourselves sometimes from our own people, and that's okay. That's part of that sovereignty. Like when there's problems, you don't have to call the police. You're supposed to call on your own people. So that's what we have now. It's like we have the police who serve as overseers. So it's like we can say free, you know, we're all this and like we're revolutionaries and all of that. But when you have a dispute with your brother or with your uncle, with your mom or with your wife or your husband, call 911. So it's like you just surrender your sovereignty. You know, and that's a symptom, that's a sickness. Not on the person who wants to be saved, but the fact that there's no systems of accountability to deal with conflict as a people. So when somebody's out there like, you know, raping women or molesting children, you know, if we're saying that we're not going to call the police, we better be able to take those roles and protect them ourselves. So this is not about like, let's just all hold hands and kumbaya, but it's like, it's all the hard questions. How are we going to deal with these problems as a people? Do we have, it's things that need to be asked and things that need to be practiced so that things work out. You know, otherwise, if there's any type of like natural disaster or anything where the system is absent, we see Katrina. We know that some people can like wild out, you know, so we need to have systems of accountability to make sure that that sovereignty is moving in a direction that's not going to replicate the system that we're under. You know, a lot of people like in the African continent where there was like wars of independence and liberation, like after a few generations ended up replicating the system that they overthrew. If anything, they even got worse at it, you know what I mean? So it's like we have to get rid of all the colonization and all these things, otherwise like all the efforts that we do are going to be in vain. So that's what we got to think about, is like, do I want my children to grow up to be free? And understanding what freedom is, not just liberty, but freedom, like true freedom, mental, spiritual, and physical freedom to absorb those things, you know what I'm saying? Like not allowing like mainstream culture to absorb like the things that makes us who we are. So that's part of asserting that sovereignty. It's like, hey, I'm not okay with you stealing my ceremonies. I'm not okay with you stealing our artifacts. I'm not okay with you, you know what I'm saying, correcting our children or correcting the way we're raising our children. That's asserting it. You know what I mean? It's not something you ask. Is it okay for me to sovereign? Is it okay? It's like, you don't ask for it, you have to do it. And like the only way that's gonna work, like my brother says, is collectively. You can't be sovereign by yourself. You can't. You know what I mean? So we have to work together in order to make all these things work. You know, especially when it comes to solving our own problems. Once we're at a level where we can deal with each other, then we can deal with other nations. You know, that's the way we gotta approach things. It's like, how can we get better communications amongst ourselves? How can we build these systems of accountability, these systems of like education and like food supplies and all these things? It's like, how many of y'all know people who go to college and got degrees? I know a whole gang, you know what I'm saying? But once they graduate, what is their aim? Is to work for somebody, right? Even if you're at the top of the chain, even if you're like, even if you graduate from college and you're no longer here, you're still here. You are never gonna be up here. Never. No matter how many degrees you get, you're never gonna be at the top of that pyramid. You know what I mean? So it's, how can we change this worldview? How can we get rid of this pyramid like structure? It's like going back to our roots.